Hi everyone, this is Chris from By Design, and in this video we're going to be taking that load from staging to final that we did last time and turning that into a dynamic load. So this is where we left off, where we had two dimensions being loaded and then a fact table. So we're going to replicate that process, but we're going to do it dynamically in the same way that we did our blob to staging copy commands dynamically. So this starts in the database level. So it starts with another load definition table. So what we have is our stored procedure name that we're going to call and our load phase. Now the load phase is very important to this process. So where we have in ADF we have customer and product loading before fact sales, we've done the same here with the load phases. So we've got load phase 1, so everything in load phase 1 will happen together, and then load phase 2 afterwards. And the other thing we have here is an isActive flag. So this just means you can switch off the load of any of these items. Sorry, I just noticed a bit of metadata that was incorrect there. So you can switch off the load of items if you choose to. So you might want to do it for testing, you might want to switch something off indefinitely, but not remove it from the table. So that's what we've got on the database side initially. And then what we've got is a stored procedure to go and get the particular items to load in any one load phase. So we pass the load phase in, and then we just say get the stored procedure name for that or names for that specific load phase. So we get all items for that specific load phase where the item is active. So without further ado, let's jump into ADF and start creating that. So what I'm going to do is just rename this staging to final to old, and I'm going to create a new version. So create a new pipeline. We're going to call this staging to final, if I can spell, and let's just put it into our demo folder here. So now what we're going to do first of all is to do a lookup to call that stored procedure to get the list of other stored procedures to call. So if we say lookup SPs to load, and our source data set is going to be our demo DB. We're going to use a stored procedure, get SPs to call, and the other thing we need to check here is that first row only is unticked because we want to get all of the stored procedures to call. So, and the other thing that we need to do is pass in the load phase. So if we jump back and import parameter, here we are, load phase. And I'm just going to hard code that for the time being, so I'm just going to set that value to 1. So I'm not going to set that to 1 actually. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a parameter. So at the package level, I'm going to create a parameter called load phase. And it's going to be a type of integer. So in our lookup, let's go and reference that. So rather than that hard coded value, let's say load phase. Perfect. So if we go and debug this now, we need to supply a value. Let's say load phase 1. Click OK. Wait for it to run. Succeeded. Okay, so what we're interested in here is the output of our lookup. So this is telling us that there are two items that have come back, and there is an array called value with each of our stored procedure names listed within it. So we can now use that value list or that value array in a foreach. So if we go and create a foreach activity, and we are going to call it, select it, and we'll call it foreach store procedure. And then we want it to be parallel, so we won't tick the sequential because we want to ideally be loading all of those items in parallel. So we can have 180 items in load phase 1 and they could all run in parallel, because that load phase item that we've created, the load phase column, is actually going to tell us that all of the items that are non-dependent can run together, and then anything dependent on any of those can run in load phase 2, and so on. So what we're going to say here in terms of the items is we're going to add dynamic content, and we want the output of look up SPs to load, and out of the output we want the value. So if we just go and double check that based on what we had before in terms of the output of that debug, we want this array. So that's what we've asked for. We've said basically we want each of the items in that array to come through into this for each. So what we can do now is add some activities, or in our case, one activity. So if we jump in here, all we're going to do now is call that stored procedure. So we're going to say execute. We're going to link to our demo DB, and our stored procedure we're going to add dynamic content for that, and we are going to say item dot, I believe it's SP name. I'm just going to double check that because this is pretty important. So if we go back to our output, it is SP name. So we want the item, which is this array, and we want this stored procedure name out of it. So let's just go back into our for each and double check that. SP name looks good. So without further ado, we will give it a go. So this should run for load phase 1, which should do our 2 dimensions, dim customer and dim product. Again, let's go for load phase 1. Okay, succeeded. And if we look at our 2 stored procedures that were executed here, if we look at the input, we've called load dim product, and we've called load dim customer. So far so good there. So it looks like everything's working. If we go and check in our database here, what I can do is just get the current time and look at our update times in our database. So just to check that it's actually doing something. So it's 12:06 and we've had an update at 12:05 and an update at 12:05. Perfect. The data is flowing through. So what I'm going to do, just to make it even clearer, is I'm just going to truncate those tables for the next run. So what we're going to do now is jump back to ADF, and this is all looking good. We've got our run, but this is specifically for a particular load phase. So what we're going to do is make that the load phase call dynamic, and this is the really clever part for me. So if we jump back to our definitions here, we've got another stored procedure, and this is getting our load phases. So what we're doing is getting the distinct load phase from our table and ordering it by the load phase. So this will allow us to have as many load phases as we want and not have to hard code them in ADF, and I'll show you how to do that now. So rather than call this staging to final, I'm actually going to change its name, and I'm going to call it execute load phase. So we've got that load phase parameter in there. So this is going to be the bit that calls the execute of the load phase, and I'm going to create a new pipeline called staging to final. So again, I'm just going to move this into my demo folder, and in here we're going to follow a pretty similar pattern. So the first thing we're going to do is actually do a lookup to get the total number of load phases. So we're going to say lookup load phases, and our source data set, same as before, demo DB, stored procedure, and we're going to get load phases. There's no parameters in this one, and again, we do not want the first row, we want the whole set. So if I just debug this quickly, we're just looking for the output, because we can use that to drive what goes into the for each. We're going to be using the value that's come out, but it's always good to check it anyway. So if we look at the output here, we've got the value out, and then we've got within that array, we've got the load phase. So follow the same pattern. We're going to use iteration and conditionals, for each, join the two up. We're going to say for each load phase, that's what we're going to call it. Now, I'm going to start with the items. So again, we're just going with that values from the previous activity. Value, should I say. But the big thing here is we want to tick the sequential, because we need it to run load phase by load phase in that order. We don't want to run load phase 1, 2 and 3 all together, because that would completely remove the point of the load phase. So we're going to say it's going to be sequential, it's going to be load phase, and within here we are now going to call our execute load phase pipeline. So if we invoke that pipeline, and if we autofill our parameters, we're waiting for the load phase, and we actually want our value from the for each dot load phase. So by having these two pipelines, this load process is completely dynamic. So this pipeline staging to final is finding out all of the load phases, and for each load phase it's calling the execute of load phase. Now there is a reason that these have to be separate pipelines, and that is because you cannot have a for each inside a for each, but you can obviously have that called to the second pipeline within the first for each, and that second pipeline has a for each. And I'm going to stop saying for each now. So what I'm going to do is run this staging to final, and hopefully we will get some data running through end to end. Not guaranteed, but we'll give it a go. So debug that. So we have succeeded, good news. So just in terms of the executing of load phases, if we just check the input there, load phase 1, load phase 2. And hopefully, if I jump back to our queries, we should see some data in these tables that we cleared out before. So inserted at 12:11 is 12:12, 12:11, 12:12. So we've loaded into all three of our tables there. So the last thing we're going to do in ADF is just join this up to our blob to staging. So we did our blob to staging. At the end of this we had our call to the original staging to final. It's going to staging to final old. We just change that to staging to final. Doesn't need any parameters to be passed in. And that is it. So for me, this along with the dynamic load from blob to staging in the copy command is where you get the absolute massive value out of ADF where you can basically have these pipelines defined, and from the point that you've defined them correctly, you don't need to change them. If you're adding in new tables, if you're adding in new loads, you add it all to your metadata. So I really hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope it helps. Please put any comments down below, and I will see you next time. Thank you.